Hello and welcome to the Cattle Show. I'm Kurt Ruppel, dairy specialist with Cargill Animal Nutrition. Today we're going to be talking about forage quality and how we preserve that quality through ensiling so it gets to your animal. Did you know that you can lose up to 50% of the nutrients that you've harvested in your forage before you get to feed it to your animal, just in how you manage the ensiling part of the process? Today's show will focus on preserving forage quality. The ensiling system is made up of harvest, filling, fermenting, and feed out. And after we're all done, we need to monitor the result of that process in order to know how well we did and where we need to make improvements in the ensiling process. In harvesting, we're concerned first off about the maturity of the plant. We need to harvest at the right time in order to get the maximum balance between NDF content, NDF digestibility, and the amount of tonnage that we're going to put in it. So we rely on certain methods of timing harvest where we're looking at the crop's maturity, physiology, whether we're monitoring growing degree days, we're measuring it with a peak stick to see how tall it is and assessing quality that way, but we need to use those systems to determine when it's the proper time to start the harvest. Also in harvesting, we got to be concerned about the moisture. So once it's harvested, if it's haylage, we need to wilt it to the right dry matter, the proper dry matter for the storage system that we're going to be ensiling. In most bunker management systems, that's around 30 to 35% dry matter. If we're talking about corn silage, then we need to go through that field and chop some plants down, dry them down, see where the dry down is at, and then go at it as best we can to get most of the crop harvested in the right moisture window. Again, 30 to 35% dry matter. Also, during the harvesting process, we need to be concerned about the particle size. We have to have the right distribution of particles, whether it's corn silage or haylage, to be a component of that TMR, so we wind up with a good mix of forage particles that prevents sorting, that maximizes rate of passage and dry matter intake, and also promotes the high digestibility. Filling the silo, we want to minimize the time it takes to fill the silo. We want to fill it as fast as we can, because when that silage is coming in, it's open to aerobic deterioration. That plant is just loaded with sugar, mixed with air. That's a combustible combination, so we're going to have respiration occurring the moment that we separate that plant from its root. It's going to start deteriorating. When it's sitting in the windrow, drying out, we can lose as much as 3% of dry matter per day just in respiration process. That plant continues to live, so it continues to respire. It's not making nutrients anymore, it's just using what it already has. And those nutrients that we're losing are the most digestible part of the plant, so quality is starting to diminish very rapidly. So we want to speed up that process as much as we can. Maximally, we don't want to have that filling process take more than 8 or 9 days. But we have to balance that with our ability to pack the silage into the silo and eliminate oxygen. So if we fill too fast beyond our ability to pack the silage, then we're hurting the whole system. So having more than one tractor, lots of weight per tractor, looking for 600 to 800 hour-pounds per ton of packing pressure while that silage is being filled is going to eliminate the oxygen and make that filling process be as efficient as possible and promote a lack of oxygen. The whole idea in filling is to get the crop in the silo and eliminate oxygen as quickly as we can. The sooner we eliminate oxygen, the sooner we shut down respiration, and the sooner we start the bacteria that are anaerobic, that require an environment with no oxygen in it, they'll start to multiply. They will produce acid. The lactic acid, acetic acid, the volatile fatty acids that we find in silage need to be an end product of fermentation. During filling, there's two processes that can degrade protein. One of those processes is heating. If it takes too long to fill, or we don't pack it well enough during filling, the heat that's created from respiration of the sugars will raise the temperature in that silage mass up to 140, 150, even beyond in terms of temperature. When we have those high temperatures, protein becomes denatured and we have undigestible protein instead of digestible protein. The other thing that happens during filling is that crop that's coming in before it's ensiled is at a relatively high pH, around a 7 pH. At that high pH, protein becomes solubilized by enzymes. We need to get the pH as low as rapidly as we can in order to change those enzymes so that they can no longer solubilize the protein. So the filling process is very important to eliminate or minimize the amount of indigestible protein that's created through heat damage and the amount of soluble protein that's created at a high pH. Another thing that happens during filling is that we can either establish a lot of mold and yeast that are going to spring back to life later in the process and ruin feed bunk life, or we can eliminate that from happening by squeezing the oxygen out very rapidly. So our filling process is key to how stable that silage is going to be when we feed it out. If we don't allow mold and yeast to be established early in this process, then they're not going to come back to haunt us later. After the filling process is over, oxygen has been eliminated, now we start the fermentation process. So once we get through that filling process and we do a good job packing the silage, we've eliminated the oxygen. That creates an anaerobic environment where lactic acid bacteria and other silage acid producing bacteria will grow. They will not grow in an oxygen-rich environment. They have to have an oxygen depleted or anaerobic environment in order to grow. So once that happens, these bacteria will produce a range of different acids depending on the moisture, depending on inoculation, depending on if we've treated it with an acid product to control what type of bacteria are doing that fermentation. These acids include lactic acid, acetic acid, propionic acid, and hopefully not, but one possibility is butyric acid. Lactic acid being produced is the goal, a lot of it, because lactic acid is 10 times stronger than the other ones. What we're doing is we're converting the crop sugar into acid. The more efficiently we can do that, as with lactic acid, the better it is, because we're going to have more sugar left after this process is all done. So one of the things that we're going to do later on is monitor the result of this fermentation process and know what the percentage of lactic acid is versus acetic versus propionic, etc. When it comes to fermentation, we've got two things to look at: the right moisture and forage additives. Having the wrong fermentation occur, producing too much acetic acid, too much butyric acid, results in a loss of nutrients because we've used too much sugar in order to get the pH down to where it's going to terminate. Plus, we can produce some compounds in the silage that are going to inhibit the cow from eating as much as she can. When the cows don't eat as much and there's not as much energy per pound, we obviously are going to diminish milk production, diminish beef production from that forage. The moisture that we chop our forage at, whether it's corn silage, grass, haylage, alfalfa, is the key critical factor that's going to determine the type of fermentation that occurs. If it's too wet, that is less than 30% dry matter, we start running the risk of having Clostridial bacteria dominate that fermentation, and Clostridial bacteria will produce butyric acid. We don't want butyric acid. Butyric acid is low in energy, it's unpalatable, it'll help to cause ketosis in fresh cows, so we want to avoid that at all costs. If we go the other side of moisture and are too dry, now we run the risk of running molds and yeast into the silage and not getting a good efficient fermentation. What we want is to hit the right dry matter range, again 30 to 35% dry matter. That's going to promote lactic acid producing bacteria to dominate the fermentation. After we have the moisture correct, the next thing that we can do as managers to try to manipulate this fermentation is to use forage additives. And again, we have two choices. One choice is to use an inoculant. Inoculant is used to try to dominate the type of fermentation that goes on. When we have an inoculant in there, we usually are trying to put a lactic acid bacteria in place that is going to overwhelm the naturally occurring bacteria and produce lactic acid. However, we have to have the moisture correct for that inoculant to work as it's designed. The other alternative is to use an acid type product. Acid will work on both ends of the spectrum that we're concerned about. An acid product will minimize the Clostridial bacteria if the silage is too wet, and acids will also knock down molds and yeast if the forage going into the silo is too dry. So we have inoculants and we have acids. Two choices. One provides bacteria and the other one inhibits organisms. Storage Mate is an example of an acid product that inhibits the Clostridial bacteria when the forage is too wet. It also is able to inhibit the molds and yeast when the forage is too dry. So when we use Storage Mate, an acid product, we don't have to have necessarily the exact right moisture level. When we use inoculants, because we're promoting lactic acid bacteria, we have to have the right moisture. So those are the choices that we have in forage additives. After fermentation is complete, the pH is now at a very low point. Temperature starts to come down in that silage. The silage bacteria that produced the acid that caused the pH to be produced are now dying off. They're killing themselves to make acid inside your silo. So what do we have to do to preserve that quality that we have so far? This is the feed out phase. So what we need to do is keep oxygen from getting back in, and we need to keep water from re-entering the silo, because water will bring oxygen with it. So we do that by building structures that are tight along the walls and that we cover with plastic and tires. Also, we need to keep that face tight as we're feeding it out. If we loosen a bunch of silage as we're getting the silage out to feed the cows, we allow oxygen to squirt inside that silo and start a whole process of mold and yeast springing back to life, pH rising, and the whole process starts to deteriorate from there. This top 3 feet that's stored closest to the plastic is what I call the red zone. That's where you're going to have the most spoilage, whether it's covered, not covered, but even if it's covered, we have oxygen coming into this silage all the time. By having a pile, you've increased that red zone percentage of the total by immense amounts. If we can store silage up against the wall, we eliminate much of that red zone. The only red zone is the very top in between the walls. And so we have much less spoilage in the silage system if we can have it stored between walls versus a pile. Many people consider this stuff, this obviously deteriorated silage, to be spoilage. That is the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. About 1/8 of the spoilage that occurred here is this type of material that you see. The rest of the spoilage occurred 1.5 feet down away from there, taking nutrients out of the plant. When you have air circulating in here, the sugar that's inside that plant respires. That means it combines with oxygen, air and water combine to form carbon dioxide, heat, and water. Carbon dioxide is dry matter loss. That's going to go up into the air. The heat is the loss of energy. It's going to heat up. And so if we just look at this top spoilage and say, oh, we've only got 6 or 8 inches of spoilage, that's wrong. We've got spoilage 1.5 feet down here that's occurring, that's robbing the nutrients out of that plant. Water coming into the silo can also cause aerobic yeast to grow that produce ethanol. Ethanol, if it's consumed by a cow, can alter the rumen fermentation, and as a result we can have milk fat depression. Everything that we've done in the ensiling process so far can be measured. So Mark, we're going to need to grab a silage sample or forage sample from this pile. In the past, or maybe some other times that we've done it, we've been quick and gotten grab samples from a couple different locations, but Right now what we want to do is have you shave that face
Sure.
like you would normally shave it to feed off cows, and then we're going to take that sample and subsample that, and I'll put it into a bag here, and we'll send it off to the Cargill Elk River Forage Lab and get it analyzed so we capture the nutrients that are going to be there, because there's such great variation in that face.
Right.
That if we just take a sample here or there or the others, we're going to misrepresent what's actually there. By having you take the time and scrape that face, then we're going to get a good representation of what nutrients are in that forage.
Sounds like the right way to do it.
Okay.
Okay.
As part of this monitoring process, we can look at the NDF content of the forage coming out to know how well we did in timing the harvest. The NDF digestibility, again, to know if we timed it right on harvest. We can monitor the moisture coming out of the silage to determine if we hit the right moisture content. We can look at the silage density by measuring how much we use in a fixed amount of space and determining if we've hit our goal of 15 to 18 pounds of dry matter per cubic foot. We can look at the acids through tests called VFA analysis, volatile fatty acid analysis. Our goal is to have a 2-to-1 ratio of lactic to acetic acid. We want that lactic acid to dominate, and we can send a forage analysis off, test it, and see what the profile is of those silage acids. Okay, great. We got a good sample to work with here, and what I'll do is I'll just go through and get a representative sample. It gives us an opportunity to look at this as well. It's nice and cool, hasn't heated up any.
It's great.
Now, there's a little bit of acetic acid there and mostly lactic acid. Great thing about the forage tested Elk River now is that for each one that we get back, we'll get a VFA report. So we'll know the exact percentage of the volatile fatty acids we got, the lactic to acetic, the propionic, et cetera.
Great.
As well as the NDF digestibility and all that. So we'll get a good sample here. And we'll have those results in our computer in a few days.
Great.
Another thing we can do is measure how good a job we're doing at feeding off that face. One of the interesting things about the way this silo is being managed is that these guys have put the date on the wall. As this face moves back, they mark the date, so that way we get to see how far back the silage is being used. And you can see today's June 30th. You got a mark there at June 27th, about 3 feet out from the face. So they're using about a foot a day. Recommendation is to use at least 6 inches a day to keep ahead of spoilage. And with a face like this, using that defacer, it's probably could get away with less than that. We just learned from these guys today that this facer not only has an advantage in not disturbing the silage away from the face where they're working it, but it's also allowed them to not have the bird damage anymore. A lot of times birds will come in here and they'll start pecking away or perch on the little outcrops of the silage face, but because of this kind of concave face and smooth and hard face, the birds aren't able to get a foothold, and so now they don't have a bird problem anymore. Good feeders will be constantly looking at the silage face to see if there's changes in quality occurring, if we've got a lot of spoilage on the top surface. If we do, we need to fork that out of there and make sure it doesn't enter into the mixer wagon and get presented to the cows. Good feeders will look at if there's moisture changes and adjust dry matter so we get the right amount of dry matter in front of that cow so that we're not feeding too little or too much forage in the diet. When we're managing forages at a higher level, what we'll do is that we'll segregate the forages by their quality. What we should have is a separate silo for high-producing cows, separate silo for transition cows, in other words, pre-fresh or close-up cows, and fresh cows, cows that have freshened within 21 to 28 days. We can have a separate storage for heifers that don't require quite the highest quality forage, and that gives us the opportunity to put in high digestible forages for transition cows, to keep out high potassium forages so we don't have issues with milk fevers, to put in the highest quality where we need to have the highest quality, that's in cows that are producing the most milk. If we do a good job in managing our forages, we should get a good result with our cow performance. One of the ways that we can tell that is that we determine how much that animal is eating. And in dairy cattle nutrition, we want to maximize dry matter intake because that's how we're going to get the maximum productivity from milk production. So knowing the dry matter coming out of the silage is going to help us determine what her dry matter intake is. Every bucket load gets measured going into that mixer wagon. We need to keep track of that. Refusals need to be accounted for. Dry matter needs to be accounted for. And we got to know how many cows were fed. Once we have all that information, it's very easy to track on a daily basis what dry matter intake is. We can compare that dry matter intake to the amount of milk produced per day, and now we've got a dairy efficiency. We should be hitting 1.5, 1.6, even 1.7 in terms of pounds of milk produced to pounds of dry matter intake consumed. Then we can put economics to that. What did it cost us to produce that dry matter that she's eating? And obviously this comes back to forage quality, because the higher the quality of forage, the less that diet's going to cost to produce and the lower that cost per dry matter. In dairy cows, the difference between a ration built with high quality forages and a ration built with low quality forages can be 30 to 70 cents per cow per day. That's a big difference. And so what do we have to do to get us that 30 to 70 cents per cow per day? Let's review. We've got to harvest it at the right time. We've got to make sure that we've got it at the right dry matter. We've got to make sure that we fill it rapidly and eliminate oxygen as quickly as we can. We've got to make sure we have a good fermentation by having the right dry matter and using forage additives that are going to determine what type of fermentation that we have. We're going to feed it out fast. We're going to keep oxygen out. We're going to keep water out. And we're going to monitor how well we did all that. I hope that you've seen the advantages of managing this to a high degree. And I hope from what we've discussed, there's some ideas here that you can take back to your operation and put into practice that will improve your forage quality situation. I'm Kurt Ruppel, Cargill Animal Nutrition, and thank you for joining us on The Cattle Show.
If you have a product or service that you'd like to see featured on a future program, or if you have questions or comments, please contact us.